suppose you and your husband will restore the gardens and make the estate a showplace again? The Drew girl suggested. Floriana's pretty face clouded. No, we do not plan so, she replied firmly. Senor Keep will sell the castle for us. He has a buyer now, he tell me. But Floriana, Mrs. Fenimore protested faintly, surely you will remain in River Heights, at least for a time. Joan and I need you. I have my career. A great star cannot be tied to her family. It grows late. You will excuse me now. We will meet again, Vera darling. Deeply hurt at being so curtly dismissed, Mrs. Fenimore moved slowly to the door, her head bowed. There she paused, the picture of dejection. Your hair, Floriana, she said, turning to the glamorous woman. When I last saw it, I dye it black, to look more like the Spanish señorita, the dancer said quickly. Nancy was firmly convinced from the woman's contradictory remarks that Madame Fernandez was an impostor, but she dared not say so. She did have the courage, however, to ask Floriana what proof she would be able to produce to establish her claim to the Heath fortune. Senor Keep have all the papers, the dancer said glibly. If anyone doubts me, let him read this. From beneath her pillow, Floriana brought forth a torn paper. Nancy instantly knew that it was the missing half of the note she had found at the Heath factory. She read the words, Day, the, S-E-A-M, hiding, will make you, then I shall be, of you, love, Walt. Nancy did not have the other half of the note with her, but she knew its contents by heart. The complete message would read, Dear C, someday the secret which I'm hiding in the wall will make me famous. Then I shall be worthy of you. Love, Walt. It seemed to the girl that here was proof Walter Heath had not sold nor used the valuable whelk dye on which he had experimented. Instead, he had it hidden somewhere in the old estate walls until he should have perfected his work. Floriana, meanwhile, had become successful. He had hoped to attain a name for himself as a scientist and thus feel he was worthy of her. You haven't the other half of the note? Nancy asked, returning the paper to the dancer. No, I lose it years ago. I do not remember what it say. By the way, did Walter Heath have a pet name for you, a nickname? The girl inquired. Oh, see, the woman said glibly. He called me Precious. No particular name? I do not understand what you mean. Never mind, said Nancy, well pleased by the reply. It doesn't make any difference. She followed Mrs. Fenimore and Joan from the room. Once outside, the child said bluntly, I don't like my new aunt. She may hear you, her mother warned. When the callers were seated in the car again, Nancy asked the widow if she were convinced Mrs. Hernandez was her sister. I don't know, the poor woman replied, weeping. Floriana is so changed. In some ways she resembles my sister. Her height and weight, the tone of her voice, yes, even her face, but the black hair makes her look different, of course. In other words, you couldn't say after 10 years that she is not your sister? No, I'm afraid I couldn't, Vera Fenimore admitted. And if she's an imposter, Hector Keith has done a good job, Nancy told herself. I'll have to produce expert evidence to outwit him. Aloud, she said, I noticed that Mrs. Fernandez had rather large feet. Her slippers must be size 8, at least. Floriana had extremely small feet, exclaimed Mrs. Fenimore. So I thought, Nancy said. I doubt that they would have changed so much. Then the woman is not my sister. I'm afraid not. That's why she's unwilling to help you and Joan. Can't we expose her? I'm going to try, Nancy said grimly. But doing so won't restore your real sister to you. I must still find her. Didn't you learn anything on your trip? The widow asked. You hinted. Nancy did not have the heart to tell her any more news. She merely mentioned having interviewed someone who thought she had met Floriana under an assumed name. I'll go right on working to find your sister until the last minute, Nancy promised. Please don't ever stop, begged Vera pathetically. If Flossie doesn't inherit the estate, she doesn't. That's all. But if she's alive, I want to see her again, no matter what it may be. I'll try to accomplish both things, were Nancy's parting words as she left Joan and her mother at their cottage. Deep in thought, Nancy drove home. As she neared the police station, she suddenly decided to drop in and get a report on Cobb and Biggs. Unaware that contacting the police was exactly what Hector wanted her to do, Nancy walked innocently into the main room at headquarters. "Miss Drew," exclaimed the sergeant on duty at the desk, "you're the very person we've been looking for. We have a warrant for your arrest." Chapter 23. In the Dungeon. Nancy was stunned at the sergeant's words. "Under arrest? What for?" The officer opened a drawer and took out the summons, which he read aloud. Nancy learned that she was charged with illegal entry and property damage and stealing. "Who preferred the charges?" the girl asked, unable to believe what she had just heard. "Mr. Hector Keep." Nancy indignantly denied all charges save one. She readily admitted she had disobeyed a no trespassing sign, but felt she had a legitimate reason for doing so. "Lieutenant Masters can explain everything," she insisted. "Please ask her to come here, and I'd like to get in touch with my father, too." Mr. Drew arrived shortly, followed by the young policewoman. He consulted privately with her, Captain Walker, and the chief of police. Nancy then was called in to tell her story. Eloquently, she spoke of what she had seen and heard at Heath Castle. She mentioned her suspicion regarding Keep's association with the two men, Biggs and Cobb, who she learned were still at large. The girl concluded by saying that she thought Keep made the charges against her to prevent her from working on the case. "There's something in what you say," the chief agreed. "Well, if Mr. Keep will let me tear up these complaint papers, I'll call everything off." But the wily lawyer could not be located, so the warrant remained intact. In the end, Nancy was allowed to go home with a promise on her part that she would come back to headquarters the following morning. She and her father talked until midnight. Then Mr. Drew insisted that his daughter get some rest. Obediently, the girl went to bed, but she could not sleep. The day's happenings had been too exciting. Hour after hour, Nancy struggled to fit together the pieces of the crazy puzzle. Several times she thought she had the problem solved, but one item kept eluding her. "Hector Keep wanted me arrested to hinder me from going to the Heath Castle. But why? Surely not because of anything I'd seen there already. Is it because of something else hiding on the place?" The girl felt sure there was something more to it than this. Suddenly, she was sure she had the answer. She could hardly wait now to get back to the police station. Tiptoeing downstairs early the next morning, before the others in the house were awake, she ate her breakfast, wrote a note to her father, and left for headquarters. The day sergeant was just coming on duty. He grinned at her, saying that she need not have reported so soon, but she hardly looked rested. "I didn't sleep a wink last night," Nancy admitted, "but I did get some ideas. As soon as Lieutenant Masters comes, I wish he might go out with me for a little while." The officer said he felt sure this could be arranged. When the young policewoman came in, the girl repeated her request. "Miss Masters, will you go to Heath Castle with me? I have a hunch the mystery will be solved there this morning." At Nancy's instigation, several policemen were detailed to station themselves outside the Heath Gardens to question anyone entering or leaving the grounds. The girl left at once with the lieutenant, and the men followed in another car. "Just what do you expect to find at the castle?" the young woman asked Nancy curiously. "It's my opinion that Hector Keep or one of his men kidnapped the real Floriana," Nancy disclosed to her companion. "He'll hold her until Madame Fernandez can establish her claim to the fortune. Keep will take the lion's share of it, and then he'll disappear." "But what has Heath Castle to do with it?" Lieutenant Masters asked. "You don't think Floriana is being imprisoned there?" "That's my theory. Maybe it's just fancy, but it's the only reason I can think of why Hector Keep went to such lengths to have me arrested. He found out I was hot on the trail of Miss Flower, the real Floriana, and he had to get her out of the way. What better hiding place for his prisoner than the castle? Then, of course, he'd have to prevent me from trespassing." "Your reasoning certainly is logical, her companion admitted. The crippled woman easily could have been brought to the place at night, locked in one of those towers. She would be quite helpless. What worries me is whether we can get in, said Nancy, after she and the policewoman had climbed the wall and set out for the castle. I'm glad those dogs are away anyway. If necessary, we can force a lock, Lieutenant Masters assured her. You have the law at your side, she smiled. Reassured, Nancy led the way to the front entrance. To her surprise, it stood ajar. Hector Keat may be here, she whispered guardedly, or perhaps Cobb, or possibly Biggs. There was not a sign of anyone stirring about the premises. Noiselessly, Nancy and the policewoman slipped inside the castle. Hearing no one, they tiptoed along the winding corridor to the courtyard garden where the entrances to the towers were. Nancy tried the door of the one in which she had been imprisoned. It was not locked. Will you stand guard while I go upstairs? Nancy asked the policewoman quietly. The other nodded, and the girl noiselessly ascended the circular iron staircase. She was gone several minutes, and Lieutenant Masters was just becoming uneasy about her when Nancy reappeared. No one there, she reported. I looked over the grounds, too, but I didn't see anything suspicious. What's next? Asked the officer. There's a trapdoor, Nancy revealed, pointing toward the floor. What it opens into, I haven't been able to find out. To raise it was indeed a task, but together they finally got it up. Cautiously, Nancy and Lieutenant Masters peered into the darkness below. The policewoman snapped on a flashlight, and they could see a flight of iron stairs leading down into a long corridor. Grilled doors opened from it. It looks like a series of dungeons, Nancy exclaimed. A regular old-time prison. Anyone below? Lieutenant Masters called. There was no answer, though her voice echoed weirdly. Then Nancy thought she heard a sound like a moan. She and the young woman scurried down the stairway. Lieutenant Masters flashed her light into the first cell. It was a tiny room, musty and dark. The only bit of sunlight filtered in through a high, barred window. These rooms must have been built to imitate the old dungeons in the original castle, Nancy commented. No doubt the Heaths used them for storing food, the lieutenant said. The next two rooms were also empty, but as Nancy and the policewoman approached the third, they distinctly heard someone moan. Pausing to listen intently, they caught a pitiful cry from the far end of the corridor. Let me out, please help me. Nancy and the young officer sped up the passageway. A small woman, crippled and weak, had pulled herself to the grilled doorway. She clung there, her eyes eloquent and beseeching. You're Floriana, Nancy said quickly. No, the prisoner shrank back. I'm Miss Flower. We'll talk about that later. Nancy unbolted the door. She and Lieutenant Masters assisted the woman along the musty corridor, but it was slow work, for she had to pause often. Who brought you here? The policewoman asked kindly. And have you been mistreated? I've had enough to eat and drink, Miss Flower said, but I've been so perplexed. Questioned by Nancy and Miss Masters, she revealed all that had befallen her. An elderly man who had shown his identification as a government agent had taken her away from Clover Farm in an automobile. It was dark when they reached their destination. She had hurried inside a dimly lighted building and was locked in the cell. I was told it was because of not paying enough income tax, she ended the story. What does it all mean? A great deal has happened since you left your home 10 years ago, Nancy said. I don't know what you're talking about. You are Floriana, Nancy said with quiet conviction. Why not admit it? No, never. Do you realize where you are now? Nancy asked, taking a different tack. It was dark when they brought me here. I could distinguish nothing. You're at Heath Castle. Heath Castle? You mean Walt? Walter Heath died a number of years ago, Nancy said gently. He loved you to the end and willed all his property to you. Walt, Dad, the woman whispered. Then, to the very end, he thought of me as I used to be, beautiful and talented dancer. He thought of you as you still are. The policewoman spoke up, a beautiful character with great charm. Floriana brushed a wisp of straggling gold-gray hair from her eyes. Her slumping shoulders stiffened. But these withered, ugly legs, she cried out. Oh, I want to be left alone with my sorrows. I have my little farm. Take me back there, please. You mean you don't want Heath Castle? Asked Lieutenant Masters.